Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 138, and it's going to be called The Patient. This is a standalone story, and I haven't decided whether to make it a part of the Connections continuity or not. You'll kind of understand why, hopefully by the end of the episode. And here we go. I don't do house calls. In fact, I don't know of any doctor who has done a house call in at least half a century. It's unhygienic, for starters. Money is not an object. You can name your price. Sorry, I actually enjoy practicing medicine. I cannot do an amputation of any kind on site unless it's an emergency. And if it's an emergency right now, then send your employer to the hospital immediately. That is not an option. Are there any circumstances under which you would be willing to come to my employer? I usually works with assistants and an anesthesiologist for surgical procedures, like the one you're rather vaguely describing. Also, a lot of my equipment isn't very mobile. Here, then. Can you work here at night after hours, with just yourself and a minimum of helpers? Yes, of course. We would need their names and a window to background them. I would have to ask their permission for that, but if you get permission to background them, I would just need two, an assistant and an anesthesiologist. That should be acceptable. One caveat. If the surgery goes badly and the patient's life is in danger, I will have to call an ambulance and have her brought to the hospital for proper care. This is non-negotiable. I believe that will be acceptable. I will check it with my employer. I will also need her patient records. You will have them. We will also need to have an initial consultation so I can learn more about this unusual amputation you say is needed and determine what needs to be done about it and how. Certainly. Can that be done also after hours with you alone? Yes. Since you've already established that she's willing to meet my price, I cannot think of anything else I need to ask from your employer. Nor we of you. Can you have an assistant and an anesthesiologist willing to be backgrounded within 2 days? I will check with them tomorrow, and if they agree, I will let you know tomorrow. That is most helpful. Thank you, Doctor. Of course. May I see you out? Thank you, but it is already after your usual closing time, I believe. Good night, then. A few weeks later, the doctor got a knock at the front door of her clinic. It was the small, middle-aged man who had spoken to her before. Formally dressed in what could have been the exact. Let's start this paragraph over. A few weeks later, the doctor got a knock at the front door of her clinic. It was the small, middle-aged man who had spoken to her before. Formally dressed in what could have been the exact same suit as he wore before, but the doctor suspected was one of many identical, expensive suits the man had. He had not changed outwardly at all, except that this time he carried a thin, expensive-looking briefcase, whose handle and locks gleamed gold in the clinic's outdoor lights. "Good evening," she said to the man, who had declined to give his name. "Good evening. I have the records here, and my employer is ready if you are." He gestured behind him at a Mercedes-Benz with tinted windows. "I am. Please invite her in," the doctor said. He did so, going to the rear passenger door and opening it. A woman stepped out, or so the doctor supposed. The man closed the door for her, then went ahead, taking the door, which the doctor was leaning against to keep open. The woman was wearing a floor-length skirt and a heavy coat, too warm for the time of year. She also had a scarf, or perhaps hood, that covered her head and even shrouded her face. She stepped up to her and held out a gloved hand. "Dr. Jessica Williams?" she said, without much of a question in her voice. "Yes, Margaret Fidelia," she replied. She looked at the woman's face, as best she could, given the relative darkness just inside the clinic and the scarf shading it even more. She had sharp yet lovely features, and her eyes were piercing, of some dark color she couldn't tell in the light, but supposed would be brown. Though her fingers were long and fine, the glove could not hide the strength of the woman in front of her. Meanwhile, the man had placed his briefcase on the reception area's counter and opened it. "The medical records you requested?" Thank you, Dr. Williams said, taking them, holding only a slight annoyance at the backward paper records. Miss Fidelia, right this way, please. When the man started to move, Dr. Williams put up a hand. I'm sorry, but HIPAA rules require me to do this in private, unless Miss Fidelia is willing to sign a form authoring you to be privy to her medical examinations and so on. I'm afraid you must stay. The man looked over at his employer. She held up a hand. Please remain here. I will be fine. He nodded, looked over at the darkened waiting area, and then took a seat. Dr. Williams brought her to the examination room. Let's talk a bit before I weigh you or do any of the other rigmarole, she said. There's been a lot of secrecy, and it's time I learned what this is about. There was a pause, and Dr. Williams felt that her patient was weighing what to say. She took this moment to see what she could of her face. It seemed like a good-looking one with piercing eyes. There was something a bit off about her skin, flaking or scaling of some kind. Finally, she spoke. I know you've been practicing medicine a long time and have seen many patients, but I need you to be ready, as I will not be like any patient you have seen before. Dr. Williams did not reply, but waited for her to continue. I have some growths on my head. They have been there almost all my life, but now they are dying. I need them removed, lest they make me sick. Okay, these things can happen. And if you're right, then yes, we would want to remove them, or sepsis could sit in. Let's see what we're looking at. Margaret gave a quick nod, then reached up with both hands and removed the scarf. Thick ropes fell around her head and shoulders. For a moment, Dr. Williams assumed they were dreadlocks, but then she saw they were made of flesh. Years of training prevented her from crying out or making some gesture of startlement or disgust. As she looked closer, and her professional curiosity caused her to immediately move in towards her patient, she saw that the woman had not hair, but snakes coming out of her head. The snakes were all dangling, dead, or perhaps dying, though she saw some movement in them. She wasn't sure what else to say. Medusa? Yes, Margaret replied, though much about the myths was incorrect. Still, I live all these centuries later. But perhaps not much longer. It seems something has snapped. The old ones are dying, and perhaps I will be among them. But as I started out as a human woman, perhaps I will be able to live for a short time as a woman again. As you can see, I have no serpent's body nor any wings, but the snakes on my head, those I have had all this time. Shouldn't I be turning to stone? I could control it, though in my anger many were petrified. But as the snakes have been dying, so I think has my ability to kill with my sight. In any case, I don't want to try it on you, for which I'm grateful. I think we have much to discuss and plan. And that's the story. I could continue it, although this also feels like a pretty good place to stop, so I will consider whether to continue this one or not. If you have any opinions on the subject, please let me know. CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words and music are copyright 2020, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.